Good evening. My name is Aaron Bowlerjack. I am the executive pastor at Oklahoma City First Church of the Nazarene and also the vice president of the Interfaith Alliance of Oklahoma. And I am grateful to be joined for tonight's panel by colleagues and friends and experts in the field. We are going to be talking about LGBT plus faith, and particularly through the lens of folks experiencing those intersections, particularly in our own state, right here in Oklahoma. And so without further ado, I want to briefly introduce each of our panelists and then allow them to provide some more introduction and context for where they live and work and or minister. Rabbi Abby Jacobson is the rabbi of Emmanuel Synagogue here in Oklahoma City. Sarah Cunningham is founder of Free Mom Hugs, and she'll talk more about that, I'm sure. Reverend Scott Spencer is lead pastor at Mosaic, and Dr. Paulette Pitt is someone that we've worked with more than once about this conversation for more than one reason, but among other things is a pediatric and adolescent psychologist, and who has these kinds of conversations with students and administrators and their parents, and will lend some insight there as well. Panelists, just want to remind you that the questions that we talk about tonight are ones that you received in advance, and I'm going to go more or less in the order that you received them. We'll have some flexibility to kind of weave back and forth, and I may have follow-up questions, but that's where we're going to begin. And I will sort of ask each of you to speak in turn, and we are grateful for your expertise and your willingness to share with us, and anxious to hear from you about these really important conversations. We'll start with, we'll say Rabbi Jacobson, who is, among other things, President Emeritus of the Interfaith Alliance of Oklahoma. Rabbi Jacobson, this may be a little bit elementary, but we're going to ask everybody anyway. Can you tell us about the faith tradition that you were raised in and where you find yourself now? Absolutely. And then also, how does that intersect with your areas of experience or expertise with the LGBT plus community in Oklahoma?
Thank you. I am one of a growing minority of people who was born into the faith where I expect to finish my life. The growing majority of a fast growing minority, possibly soon to be majority, of Americans will die in a faith tradition, denomination, or religion different than the one in which they were born. I was born and raised Jewish. I was a member of a conservative synagogue. I have moved in deepening my own observance of the laws and traditions, and obviously because I'm a rabbi, but also as a human being. I've been in Oklahoma for almost 13 years now, and my role within the LGBTQ plus community is as an ally, and I appreciate being able to say that the Jewish community in Oklahoma is as pluralistic and diverse as it is in the rest of the world. We have some synagogues in Oklahoma that have same-sex marriage and that have gender-neutral bathrooms and gender-neutral language on their membership applications, and we have some that don't. And so our synagogue certainly does to both of those, and I'm hopeful to be able to strike the balance between helping our members of the LGBTQ plus community feel welcomed and loved, in addition to affirmed, and also to, in our love, not be weird about it. I think that's a role of a lot of allies, to make people feel loved without making them feel tokenized or singled out, and God, we're trying real hard.
Always a challenge in virtually any family or faith community, for that matter, to show love and also not be weird about it. Rabbi Jacobson, I appreciate a point you bring up early that I wanted to address. Judaism is not monolithic. Christianity is monolithic. There's not a faith tradition that is entirely monolithic. There are orders within Catholicism, Orthodoxy, orders within Buddhism, orders within persons of no faith that have different areas of interest and conviction when it comes to talking about the intersections of faith and human sexuality. And so I appreciate you pointing that out, because there are a lot of different Christian takes on this conversation, and Christian takes are not the only takes on this conversation. And so I appreciate you bringing that to front of mind. Sarah, would like to come over to you. Tell us a little bit about the faith tradition you were born into, if any, where you find yourself now, but then also how you interact with the LGBT plus community here in Oklahoma, maybe as a result of your faith convictions, maybe not.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I was born and raised here in Oklahoma under the Christian denomination, a woman of faith. We joined a church close to our home. I didn't really get serious about my faith walk until I had children. And we joined a church that's within walking distance of our home. We served there for 20 years, and I considered myself a Christian who just happened to go to a Southern Baptist church. And we served there for 20 years. And when our youngest son came out, as in saying he was gay, he is gay, he met someone, we didn't know how to have that conversation within the church. And so it was a process that I say it took us from the church to the Pride Festival, and without losing my faith. And I still consider myself a woman of faith. And my expertise would be that I'm a mother with a gay son, and I've gotten educated on the history of human sexuality, science, evidence, but ultimately hearing from gay Christians, hearing their stories, and just seeing the fruit from the community that convinced me that this truly, I believe, is a gift from God, this community. And what a wonderful dynamic it brings to our families, to our communities and the world around us. So it's been a great journey, but I would like to add also that I feel like I experience God and the power of the Holy Spirit and the sense of community and humanity even greater than I thought I could. So I'm thankful for conversations like these.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Sarah, I'm sure we'll talk more about it as we go, but can you give us just a little bit of insight in how learning those stories and having those experiences led to the creation of Free Mom Hugs, and kind of what the point of that is?
Yes, happy to. When my son turned 21, he met someone, and seeing him go from anxiety, depression, self-harm, at-risk behavior to living authentically and happy and healthy, and seeing people celebrate my son really kind of put me in check. And where he gave me an ultimatum like, Mom, I want you in every area of my life, but how much of that is up to you? So I really challenged where I had to just reconcile and just deconstruct and reconcile my faith in that way. And then ultimately meeting his friends, getting plugged into the community and hearing their stories. And in 2014, my husband and I stood with our son at the Pride Festival, and that was my first real interaction with the community. And I just fell in love, and I just, I had a religious experience, if you will, at 39th and Penn. And then in 2015, I made a homemade button and I pinned it to my sundress. And with anyone who made eye contact with me, I would say, could I offer you a free mom hug? And the first hug went to a beautiful young woman who said that it had been 4 years since she got a hug from her mother. And from that experience, we started the nonprofit Free Mom Hugs. We have chapters in every state now of moms just like me, and dads and friends and allies who our goal is just to pour into the community and their families to encourage authentic relationships. And I love our mission statement, Erin. It says, we empower the world to celebrate the LGBTQIA plus community through education, visibility, and conversations. And yes, we still give hugs.
Which kind of brings us back around to where we left off with Rabbi Jacobson. You know, we hope to offer love and not make it weird, but offer love, even and including in the form of a hug. That's beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. Dr. Pitt, what about you? Tell us a little bit about the faith tradition that you grew up in and kind of where you find yourself now, but then also a little bit about your experience and expertise interacting with the LGBT plus community in Oklahoma.
Yeah, so kind of like Sarah, I was born and raised in Oklahoma and grew up in the Baptist tradition. But then when I was 22, I became part of the International Churches of Christ and was a part of that until I think I was about 37. You know, as I was reflecting upon this discussion today, one of the things that really struck me was my experience there and how much it parallels, I think, what happens a lot of times to our friends who are seeking something different and how they are received in the religious community. And the reason that really struck me was because as a woman of faith in a religious organization, I was, people were not very happy with me because I was not a traditional religious woman. I decided to pursue education as opposed to how I was supposed to behave as a religious woman. And yeah, and I got a lot of grief about that. And basically got talked to a lot about how wrong I was and how I was doing all the wrong things. And that really damaged, I think, my view on religion, and it damaged my faith in God for a long time, unfortunately. But so I really can connect and understand how people who don't fit the traditional mold of sometimes what religion tells us we are supposed to be, how they can be hurt from those kinds of interactions, and how it can hurt them not only in the immediate, but how it can hurt their long-term experience with God. And so I think I've healed a lot since then in terms of my relationship with God, but I wouldn't say I necessarily trust denominational religion because of those experiences. My intersection, though, with the LGBTQ community comes because I have been a provider for folks who are on their journey, whether it's their journey regarding their sexuality or their gender identity, to help them move in the direction that's authentic for them. So that's kind of how I have come into contact with the community. I have worked with children and adolescents in that capacity. And I've also worked with a lot of families in trying to help them navigate this process, not only for their child, but to reconcile how do I navigate this process and support my child in the context of I'm a religious person. So that's how I come into this and have experienced kind of both ends of this intersection.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Dr. Pitt, I really resonate with this idea, and looking around the screen, I know that Pastor Scott and Sarah and Rabbi Abby would as well, that the most difficult experience, of course, is the coming out much of the time for the person who is of a minority sexuality of whatever type. But there is also often, particularly in religious circles, and especially in conservative religious circles, something akin to a coming out experience for parents and allies and affirming clergy as well. And in addition to the experience of the individual, there are sort of other, not the same, but related sort of ripple effects in the lives of folks who choose to support them. And for the ways that you and we have experienced that, I'm really sorry. And I want to say specifically, as someone who's married to a woman who's working on a doctorate, the idea that science and faith are somehow in opposition to each other, or that femininity or womanhood and education are in opposition to each other, or that faithful participation in a community and making choices that stand out within that community, the idea that those things are in opposition to each other, Christianity is not a monolith, and I don't represent all of Christianity. But I am a pastor, and I want to say on behalf of the church, capital C, we were wrong. When we told you that, we were wrong, and I am sorry. It's just garbage and it's not true.
Yeah, yeah. And I have come to appreciate that over time, that, you know, some of my greatest supporters have also been from people inside the church. And I think that we can do this for the LGBTQ community as well. And I do think that people, God is love. We need to be loving. That's the end, you know, of all people. So I appreciate that. But and I hope that we can help people from our experiences of looking at past mistakes.
That's beautiful. I appreciate that. Pastor Scott, what about you? When you talk about faith traditions of birth or origin, and then also kind of where you find yourself now, or the journey you find yourself on now, can you talk to us about that? But then also your experience or expertise in interacting with the LGBT plus community, particularly in Oklahoma.
Sure, thanks. And thanks, Aaron, for having me. Whoever was maybe invited me to be a part of this, I appreciate it. Great group of people on this panel. I was born and raised here in Oklahoma in Enid. Grew up in 70s and 80s and in the United Methodist Church. That's the tradition that my parents chose to raise me in. My dad had come from that tradition. My mom had come from the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in a very small town where there wasn't a lot of denominations. But raising their children, my sister and I, they felt most comfortable, in the United Methodist Church there in Enid. And I would look back on that and say it was sort of a centrist kind of church, maybe right leaning in terms of politics and even theology. I went to Oklahoma State and lived there in Stillwater for 5 years. And I lived in Kentucky for 4 years. Then when I came back, I've lived really in a lot of places in Oklahoma. I spent 5 years in the southwest part of the state. I spent 8 years in Ada, 5.5 years in Ponca City. And I've done quite a bit of traveling just as a United Methodist pastor and involved in various things. And the United Methodist Church sort of prides itself on bringing together sort of a religion of the heart as well as a religion of the head. There's a kind of a famous quote from one of our founders, our main founder, John Wesley, about sort of bringing together the head and the heart, where in some places those are divided. And so, but I will say that when it comes to the question of LGBTQ plus persons, we have sort of fallen on the more conservative side and not really affirmed. We would say we affirm them, but we don't necessarily affirm them. We welcome them. We say we love them. We say there's a place for them, and we say we'll support their civil rights. For example, we don't think that landlords should kick you out just because you're LGBTQ. But then, as a denomination, we have said repeatedly for 50 years that we don't really believe in same-gender marriage, and we don't believe in the ordination of LGBTQ persons if they are married, for example. It's complex. You could be bisexual and married to somebody of the opposite gender, and it really wouldn't be a problem. But if you were gay and married to someone of the same gender, then we would not approve of that. But we are a very open denomination that's very open to debate and discussion and change in the church. At one time, the church, we didn't have ordained clergy who are female, and now we do. At one time, a lot of our church supported slavery, for example, if not really outright, maybe indirectly. And now we're really against slavery. And so change does come to the church. We used to have some very racist structures in our denomination, which we've dismantled. But then when it comes to the question of LGBTQ persons, we've sort of held the line on saying no to marriage, no to ordination, unless you're single and celibate. And we have said if you're single and celibate, that's okay. But a lot of folks have been really for 50 plus years working to change that in the denomination. And I would say until about 2014 or 15, 2014, I sort of fell in this camp of not really talking about it much and not really bringing it up on my own. But if people brought it up in my churches, I was willing to talk about it. But it wasn't like an issue that I was bringing to the forefront, and I wasn't trying to champion, any cause. But I was trying to be very pastoral in my response and talk about this loving God who accepts all people. And quite honestly, I didn't want controversy in my churches, and I was serving in some smaller and rural churches. And in about 2014, I just made the decision that it was actually time to really take a stand for change in the church, and began to take that kind of public stance, which I don't want to take away from those who come out, but you are correct that for allies, there's also a coming out, and allies take a lot of hits as well. And so I've been working, really since 2015, very strongly for change in the denomination, because I've been appointed to a church here in the city, which we call a reconciling church, which means that we are fully affirming of the LGBTQ plus community. Until just recently, we said we want to do weddings, but our hands are tied. And recently we said, well, we're not going to care about our hands being tied anymore. We're going to go ahead and do them if, and with the proper counseling, the proper, discussion with the pastor, if we discern this is a good wedding, a good marriage, we're going to go ahead with it. And whatever happens with the denomination, we'll deal with that later. Because we got to the point we said we cannot look in the eyes of human beings anymore and tell them we want to marry you, but we can't. That just began to feel more and more, to be honest, I don't know if crappy. It just felt crappy to say that to somebody. And I decided I couldn't say that to anybody anymore. It didn't make any sense. It wasn't who I was anymore. And I couldn't let fear of the denomination, lead me and guide me anymore in that way. And so in a lot of ways, I've been primarily working in the church and the denomination, but I think since living in the city, I have tried to be a voice here in the city. And one of my first things to do was, I think it was Freedom, Oklahoma, maybe. They had a press conference. This was in 2014. And one of my clergy friends was asked to talk at that press conference. And so they asked some of their colleagues that they knew were supportive to come and support them. And, as we left the Capitol that day, we were all calling our superiors saying, by the way, we're going to be on channel 9 tonight, channel 5 tonight, we may be in Oklahoma tomorrow, just giving you the heads up. And that was really, my coming out in terms of publicly standing up for this community, which is marginalized, and in our state, especially today, feeling the pressure of that any rights that have been gained could be taken away. And so, it's just important. We're all in this together, and no matter what it is, whether it's the rights of women or other minorities or refugees, whatever it is, there's a lot of commonalities, and we're really in this together. So
I appreciate that. Thank you, Pastor Scott. And I appreciate your use of language that I think I originally maybe learned from Sarah, or at a conference that Sarah and I were attending together, the difference between welcoming and affirming, particularly in the Christian tradition, and maybe in the Protestant Christian tradition more specifically. To welcome is to say, you are welcome and we will love you and you can hang out with us and we would like to hang out with you. And there are some limits on how you can be involved. But to be affirming of someone who is an LGBT plus relationship means offering to them what I call, I don't know if I invented this language, I hope not, the 3 M's, that is membership, marriage, and ministry. And so, for example, Scott, you said in the UMC tradition, officially, you would be welcoming, because what's available to an LGBT plus person who's in a non-traditional relationship would be membership, but that would be all, not marriage and not ministry, credentialing, or licensing. And I think it's really important, and I appreciate you pointing us to that specificity of language. Circling back around, and Rabbi Jacobson, we'll start again with you. In your experience, whether it's working with congregants or family members or whoever, in your professional and lived experience, what are some challenges facing the LGBT plus community in Oklahoma particularly?
I appreciate that. I think that I don't think this is going to be original. I think there is a tension in the Jewish community. We talk about the mitzvah of Klal Yisrael, the commandment of Jewish unity and unity within the Jewish community. We are an extreme minority in all but one country in the entire world. And before 1948, we were an extreme minority in every country in the world. There is a sense of ethnic, cultural, national, almost tribal unity within the Jewish community across time and space, no matter what country we live in or what time of the past or present we're living in. And that's really challenging for people who cannot say that they would be as eagerly welcomed, affirmed, or loved in every community. I'm sure that that's true of every religion, as you pointed out before, Reverend Bullerjack, that no religion is a monolith. I think there is also a problem that many minority communities face, where one comedian put it so succinctly, oh, those are two different Simpsons characters. Like, you can only be one minority at a time. And so how can you possibly be Jewish and something else? How can you be a gender minority or sexuality minority and also be Jewish? I think there is also a, within our movement particularly, we call them movements, not denominations, it's the same thing. In the conservative movement, we are conservative with a capital C. And that sounds a lot like conservative with a small c, which we're not. And there is confusion within our movement over, especially for people who may have been away from Judaism for a while or away from formal Judaism for a while. Would they be welcome? And are we the kind of community that would be welcoming, affirming, frostily not hostile, or any of the other things? And so that can be a barrier to entry, and particularly because we're not perfect and we need help being a better place, a safer place for everyone. We try our hardest, but we need people, we need stories, we need representation, we need to know how to do it better. There can be a barrier of, is this going to be welcoming enough? And unfortunately, in some cases, people who come to the synagogues in Oklahoma that are both welcoming, and I'm new to this language of welcoming and affirming, but I'm trying real hard, cultural translation, in communities where they are able to get married, in communities where there are rabbis who are members of the LGBTQ plus community, whether in this particular location or at least somewhere in the world, of not of coming with that hurt from houses of worship before, and hurt from other synagogues, hurt from other communities. Sometimes if people are converting to Judaism, hurt from other religions. I think, as you all have said, we all have to deal with that. And so, trying to be everything that everyone needs us to be, trying to have our ears open and our eyes open, and trying to introduce those changes. We had a dear and sweet congregant of blessed memory. She's passed on now. She was our membership committee chairperson for years and years. And every time something would come up that was a little new, oh, this person is joining as a member with his friend, husband, friend, partner. All right, partner. And would quote from the end of Fiddler on the Roof, "It's a new world, Golda." And so every time we go through something, whether it's, oh yeah, we have some gendered language we need to remove on our membership application. Oh yeah, we need to make sure that we're open for children in our religious school who have one parent, two parents, also step parents of various genders, gender presentations, and sexualities to make sure that all of our language is opening and affirming. Every so often someone will go, "It's a new world, Golda," just because we're working forward and occasionally tripping our way through things. But I assume that a lot of people are dealing with the same things.
That's beautiful. I appreciate that. And that sort of open-handed approach that we're going to keep trying to do the right thing and recognize we may not always know what that is. And our understanding of that may continue to shift. But we're going to keep trying to love people and be inclusive. I also really appreciate, Rabbi Jacobson, you drawing us to the idea that advocacy on behalf of marginalized communities is incredibly important. And maybe the only thing that's more important is listening to them first. That those two things are intimately connected, but the one has to be rooted in the other to be most loving and perhaps most effective. But I really appreciate the way that you've pointed us to that relationship, as well as to the idea, and Sarah and others have spoken and can speak to this more, that often part of the difficulty of coming out in a religious context, and particularly in a conservative religious context, is the way that spiritual trauma and abuse can be sort of layered on top of some of the other difficulties of how folks identify or how they present. And the fear of the one in response to the other can be a really difficult and challenging thing as well. Sarah, what would you have to say to us about challenges facing the LGBT plus community and the LGBT plus interfaith community, particularly in Oklahoma? What are some of those difficulties and challenges?
Well, as we're having this wonderful conversation, I'm reminded of some of the first lessons that I was hearing from the community. And you're right, it's like a whole new language, the LGBTQIA Two-Spirit Plus, and that's evolving. And I love the acronym. I was in my 40s before I understood the difference between a gender identity or sexual orientation. I was in my 50s before I really understood the significance of a little gay bar in New York City called the Stonewall Inn, because I didn't have skin in the game, you see, and what I had access to. We didn't talk about gay things in school. We didn't have same-sex couples in our church. So it's what you're exposed to. But all that to say, what I heard the most from the community is that not only are they alienated from their families, from their church homes, and from many parts of society, but the loss of the sense of belonging and learning about chosen family and learning about the word triggering, like worship, praise and worship music. I mean, so important, and just the language. And then I remember the first time I saw a church walk in the Pride Parade with a banner. I think it was Scott in the Mosaic Church, or Pastor Kayla with Open Arms. I cried because I thought, this is happening. And when I see a rainbow banner on the side of a church, it tells me that's a safe place for my child, and a place where I would want to worship. And all that to say, representation is so important. To have diversity, inclusion within a congregation, to worship together, to participate in the faith, and to serve a community, and to almost like reclaim that space. In Oklahoma, conversion therapy is still legal, sought out, and paid for. If you're not familiar with conversion therapy, it's any type of therapy, practice, or prayer that would try to change a gay person into a straight person, quite simply. It's dangerous, it's deadly, it needs to stop. And shame is the biggest sin of all. Shame, even of ourselves. And the Equality Act, my son could be denied housing, healthcare, even refused service in a public space because of who he is in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, 29 states, that's legal. These are legal situations in 29 states. And lastly, 60% of Americans are aware of this. And just pleading the power of fear and ignorance, and knowing even more than that is the power of love and education. So the church has a mighty task before it. I believe it's possible. I believe it's time, but for allies to stand up, speak out, and let your neighbors know where you stand as an ally, and for the church to allow a platform for this beautiful community to share their stories. It's enough that I can share. I can go to a Baptist General Convention and see how they're going to, approach women, save the women's sports. But allow our transgender friends and family a space to share their story, to change the social norm. And that's where, because it changes in our home. And the last thing, and I swear I'll shut up, is that the most powerful, I heard this on the Pray Away film. If you're not familiar with that, you can Google it and see it later. But someone in that film said, the most powerful force that we can use against someone is their faith. And isn't that true? We need to be building each other up in our faith. And anyway, it's a beautiful thing. It's possible. It needs to happen. It's a challenge. But there's such a redemption story here that it brings me great joy and encourages me.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Sarah. You have reminded me that when someone is dissociated from, or disenfranchised by, or rejected by, or excommunicated by their faith community, they are losing that point of contact with faith, but also, and perhaps more importantly, they're losing that contact with that community. And so it makes perfect sense that marginalized folks, particularly in the LGBT plus community, would be quick to point out, yeah, my faith is important, but also a big part of what I've lost is my community and the people that raised me, and often close friends, and far too often family members. And that is heartbreaking and important, and something that I think we need to name every time we have this conversation. And I appreciate you drawing attention to that. Thank you. Dr. Pitt, as a person, as someone who is a clinician, you can take this any direction you want. What are some of the particular challenges facing interfaith LGBT plus folks in Oklahoma that you'd like to draw our attention to?
Well, as Sarah brought up, one of my biggest concerns is the practice of conversion therapy. That really bothers me greatly. I had the opportunity to speak to the House committee that was considering banning that bill. And it was a great privilege to be able to do that. That practice is very concerning because it leads to greater despair, more rejection, and frankly, the end of that road sometimes is suicide, which is.
But before we go any further, Dr. Pitt, can you unpack for us how you would define conversion therapy, and then also why it's so problematic? But I want folks who are maybe brand new to this conversation to have an idea, and I think hearing it from you as a scientist is a great way to kind of open that up. And thanks for opening the door, Sarah. But how would you define conversion therapy, and then why would you be so opposed to it as a mental health professional that you'd be willing to testify before the Oklahoma House Committee considering taking up a bill to ban it?
Sure. So conversion therapy is the practice of really using kind of a religious backdrop or foundation to convince someone that they are not experiencing a different type of sexuality or a different gender than what a religious community believes that they should be experiencing. And it's an effort to convince that person that they are not experiencing their authentic self when they are expressing, I'm gay, or I identify as a male. So the practice invalidates that person's experience, true, authentic self-experience and basically calls it into question, which creates a whole emotional upheaval for the person that's subjected to that type of experience. On the mental health front, what concerns me, so much what concerns me about that practice, it concerns me on the level that we are not, we're doing the very opposite. Practitioners who practice that are doing the very opposite of what it is that we're talking about here today. It's not affirming, it's not accepting, it is rejecting, it is stigmatizing. And as you can imagine, any person or group of people who've experienced those types of rejections are prone to significantly more mental health issues. They're prone to suicide ideation, they're prone to suicide attempts. It's incredibly damaging and misguiding in terms of them being able to be true to themselves, and it doesn't speak on any level of acceptance. So there are great concerns about this type of, and I'm using air quotes, therapy, because it is not. It actually goes against all the tenets of good therapy even. So it's shocking that it's called therapy to me. I think the other thing that concerns me greatly is just the backlash recently against the LGBTQ community. It really concerns me that there's such pushback against just basic affirming behaviors that we could have to support and accept people. And laws are being enacted that marginalize people and clearly reject where they're at or their ideologies or what their needs are. And I'm seeing this increasingly in politically conservative states. So like Oklahoma, there is a lot of laws that are trying to be put on the books to really marginalize this group of people. And that concerns me as well. And I think the root of it, I think the thing that concerns me the most is much of the root of that lays in a foundation of religiosity and a misunderstanding of what true love looks like, what God's love looks like, because it doesn't look like that. And that's what concerns me greatly.
That's important. And I appreciate your willingness to continue to ground our conversation in a truth that I think most, perhaps not all, but most religious movements and faith traditions and denominations would say is that a primary attribute, and hopefully the primary attribute of God, is one of love. God is love, love with a capital L. And when we start there, we often wind up in better and more inclusive places. And when we don't, we can get in the weeds really quickly. And those bills are floating around, and I will leave it to folks to research them because it's not difficult and they're not hard to find. And it is not just about the past. Pastor Scott, how would you help us, or what would you like to point to when you talk about particular struggles facing interfaith LGBT plus persons in Oklahoma?
Well, I was taking some notes because I was afraid everybody would take my ideas, but I'm amazed at kind of what I did write down. One, I just want to go back to one thing that Rabbi Jacobson said, the difference between welcoming and affirming. I think my experience with specifically the Christian church, and I think even more so with the conservative Christian church, there's not a church that really wants to say, we don't welcome LGBTQ people, we don't hate them, we love them. But the catch is they want to say, yes, come into our environment so that we could also make sure that you change the way we think you should change. In other words, um, a person who loves Jesus is going to be celibate, or God's going to heal you, and you're going to marry, you're going to be straight, that kind of thing. So I think that's a very key difference, that some people, they walk into churches and they like the music, they like the community, they like the pastor or the messages. But key questions to ask are, what is your view of marriage? Because if they're not willing to even entertain the marrying you, that tells you right there that there's the difference between welcoming and affirming. And, can I be a leader? Can I teach Sunday school? Can I be on the council, the governing board? Can I be whatever it is? And if the answer is no, that gives you a big clue about their definition of welcoming, and it's not really affirming. And I think that's an issue for Oklahoma, because we are in the Bible Belt. We are, even though religion is becoming less and less of a commitment from people, we still are a religious environment. And so people are sometimes, they are looking for a religious, spiritual home or connection. But I think a couple of other things I would lift up, which are, one of them is really easy, that's pronouns. We also know that if we just use the name and pronouns that someone tells us is their name and their pronouns, they're healthier, they're happier, they're more likely to not commit suicide. The headlines right now is a professor who, sued the university because he didn't want to be forced to use the pronouns that a student said, these are my pronouns, and that professor actually won. I've not looked at the details of that, but I also think, how could that professor go to bed at night knowing that the battle is over with a person that professor knew in the classroom was really over some ideology, right? And not that person's real life, but I'm sure the professor would say it is about their real life. But let's expand that to restrooms. Stillwater, I guess, has been really affirming of their trans students. And now they're saying, we want the state to solve this for us. That's the headline I saw. I didn't read the article yet, but I saw the headline. We need the State Board of Education to solve this for us. And I'm not for sure, where's that coming from? Is that because of the pressure of the people coming to the board meetings? But I've just noticed in the past few years, for example, in Oklahoma City, many of our newer restaurants, and even some of our older restaurants now, have non-gendered restrooms. They may have two restrooms that 5 years ago that was a men's and a women's, and now it just says restroom, and you get to pick to go in the right or the left. And I'm not trans, but if I was trans, and I was just in my hometown of Enid the past few days, not only does the restroom sometimes say men and women, but it's like, oh, the men, you're a bull rider. And this was literally in a restaurant in Enid, right? And if you're a female, you're a barrel racer. This is on a steakhouse. I'm like, so not only does it gender us, but then it puts us into stereotypes, right? And I have to admit,
can be something as simple and insidious as men wear pants and women wear dresses, and that's the silhouette.
What about if we were wearing kilts? If we were in kilts, we'd have to go to the only one of the restaurants. No, but in my own church, I've been keenly aware, but I've not acted on it. But in our men's, we have signs that say our restrooms can be used by anybody, and for a variety of reasons. You could be helping your older parent or a disabled child, whatever. And but it still does say men and women. And I admit that we are somewhat of a small church, and I know some churches have, they may have a men's and women's and then a gender neutral. Our goal would be to have gender neutral, but they currently are, but they still say men and women. But one is painted in blue and one is painted in pink. And and I've been aware of this on an intellectual level, but only recently did somebody who has changed their pronouns in the course of the past 6 years I've known them said, we were talking about the restrooms, and I was just kind of saying, you can use whichever one you want, but that person's also struggling. But they also said, could we just not have that restroom be painted pink, which is very stereotypical for this day and age, right? I don't know if pink has always been for women, but it certainly is in our day and age, right? And I'm keenly aware of that. And it's simple things like that a lot of people never think about. But unless I have a sister who is mentally disabled. So I'm aware of a lot of things that other people aren't aware of. And it's not until you really are aware of these things, just like Sarah has mentioned, and we've all, I'm sure Rabbi Jacobson is the same boat. We we become aware of these things, like the language we use in our rituals, in our faith communities. And at Mosaic, we try very hard to not just be neutral in our language, but also just to be expansive in our language. And, you know, we could call God God, but we also sometimes refer to God as mother and sometimes refer to God as father. And, but we just try to be very creative about that and always open to that and not feel like it's settled. Because I think in the past, we felt like it was settled. Oh, if we just call God God, don't call God either, you know, father or mother. But now we've realized that also kind of puts God in a box as well. And it's just interesting the way things change, because things have changed in the past 5 years. They certainly have changed since I was a teenager, right? I mean, and I think that's one of the challenges is for those of us in leadership is to be aware of the changes. And I think in our own community, we're sort of experiencing that because now we have two prides, and I don't want to get involved in the politics of that. But I think part of that is over generational issues and some new things that have entered into the conversation, right? And the intersectionality of race and sexuality and gender identity. And I think that, and who gets to be in the limelight, right? I mean, so I just think the fact that we have two pride organizations is a challenge, but not necessarily a bad challenge. I think it's a good challenge. It can be rough at times, I think. I mean, I think there's some roughness out there, but I think we can work through it. And I think it's great we have two prides, actually, as long as there wasn't any resentment or bickering or fighting, right? But I think that's just an indication of how things are changing. And some of us are slower to change than others, right? And I'm kind of getting to that age where I'm a little bit slower to change myself, you know? And as a leader of my church, I mean, we say we want younger people. And, you know, I would say prior to 2015, the very word queer would not be used, you know, in a worship service, certainly. And I get that. That is to some people, that is like saying the N word, right? But I think a lot of younger people have reclaimed that word. And therefore we have this, even in the church, we have a younger person using that word. Older people saying, oh my gosh, I'm triggered because when I was in third grade, I was called that and beat up on the playground, right? And so for 50 years, that word was never used. And now we see it everywhere, and go to Pride and it's everywhere. And so that's an indication of just the challenge for the community, I think, the challenge that's before us. And I think we as faith leaders, not just ordained clergy or rabbis, or, you know, and we've even seen the Muslim community become involved in this because of the intersectionality of it, you know, just like Rabbi Jacobson was talking about the feeling like a minority in terms of being Jewish, and certainly like also them being Muslim in Oklahoma, you know. And people have asked me sometimes, you know, what do they believe? And I'm like, well, I'll tell you this, I may not know what they believe exactly, but they come and they show up when other groups also are being ostracized or, you know, whatever. So
And
I think we as leaders,
I really appreciate that, Pastor Scott, the way that you keep drawing our attention back to the difference between ideology and identity. When we choose to focus on ideology, that colors the way that we other different folks. And we can focus and fight about ideology in a way that would be hopefully more difficult, if not impossible, if what we were focusing on were the identity of the persons involved and the identity of the persons being marginalized. That's really helpful. Thank you. Coming back to you, Rabbi Jacobson, again, no faith is monolithic. And I want to invite each of the panelists to sort of preface your remarks with something like, in our family, or at our synagogue, or in our tradition. I'm not asking you to speak for or answer for the crimes of anybody else, but I would love to hear a little bit about how your tradition or your local worshiping congregation understands the intersectionality of faith and human sexuality, and particularly minority sexualities. And something I've heard you speak about in particular, Rabbi Jacobson, is the kind of nuance that's built into a Jewish appreciation for gender identity and expression. So I'll ask each of you, but I'll start with Abby because I know she's a rock star at this particular question. How does your tradition make space for that kind of intersexuality, and what nuance exists in those conversations.
I appreciate that. Thank you. There is a time in Jewish tradition that predates denominations, and all the way back to the times of the Mishnah and the Talmud, the collections of the oral tradition from the post-biblical era through the 6th or 7th century. There are, depending on how you count, 3 or 4 different categories of intersex recognized in Judaism. And although Judaism has been traditionally rigidly binary in certain ways, the idea of speaking about an intersex person who can be married as a man or as a woman, either way, speaks to each faith tradition grows in its own way and is ahead of the curve in some ways and behind the curve in some ways. And so in Jewish tradition, it would not be wrong to say that some of our sages have believed that many of our sages have believed that everyone is basically bisexual, and that sexual attraction is about situation and not necessarily about the person's body or the person's gender presentation. And rules are made around sexuality in Judaism that are independent of other things. So there are rules about marriage. Most Jewish denominations historically do not love the idea of premarital sexuality or premarital sexual contact. However, if a person is going to engage in sexual contact, regardless of whether it is with that person's spouse, that person's partner who's not yet a spouse, that person's one-night stand in a bar, that person's married next door neighbor, even though Judaism very much frowns on adultery, there's still a set of expectations around sexuality that are completely independent of the propriety of the context. So in more conservative small c parts of the Jewish world, more what one might call fundamentalist parts of the Jewish world, kissing someone who's not your spouse or who is not yet your spouse is just as bad as any of the other things you could do with someone you met in a bar. And I believe with greatest respect,
they might also have something to say about you meeting people in bars.
By and large, Jews are drinkers. By and large, we are a this worldly religion that believes that intoxication is just one of many ways of being joyful. And so long as you stay on this side of joyful, and we don't go all the way to Noah, Lot, or any of the really extreme examples of drunkenness, it's all right, as long as it doesn't stop you from going to work in the morning or make you a mean person. So, but a person who chooses to engage in kissing is not doing the same thing as a person who chooses to engage in sexual intercourse. And a person who chooses to engage in non-consensual kissing is not doing the same thing as a person who chooses, in Jewish law, to engage in consensual kissing. And I think that this really echoes back further than our contemporary ideas of propriety to a time in Jewish tradition when Judaism is a religion which is aggressively legal, because the best way we can find to create common ground between people is law. And so you can't mandate in Jewish tradition, you can't mandate what someone believes, thinks, or feels, but you can mandate how they act. And so to say it is not acceptable to do X, but it is acceptable to do Y or Z is in many ways in our tradition an easier conversation than what you ought to do. Because we can say the genders of Adam and Eve are irrelevant and the sexes of Adam and Eve are irrelevant. What does the Torah say about marriage? Shockingly, The Torah does not specify what gender a person has to be in order to get married, because marriage laws in the Torah are few and far between. And the ones that are expressed tend to be expressed incidentally. It's just expected that people understand that sort of thing. And so, because historically there's been that leeway, when you have someone who, again, hearkening back to the 4th century, is intersex, is physically neither 100% male nor 100% female, or who has physical sexual presentation of a body that is not what we think of as 100% male or 100% female. And again, please excuse me if I'm using the wrong words. I am golden retrievering my way through a subject that is not my subject to talk about. I'm just trying to make my way through the language in a way that I hope is being sensitive. That to say we have to make a rule because we have this human being here who, at that time they assumed, wants to get married, and therefore we have to be able to have a place for this person. And when we have a place for this person, we now have a rule. And now that we have a rule, we can expand that to the next time a different Jewish community has another person. I think that the idea that Judaism has also about gender, and I'm trying to introduce this briefly, extremely old school, extremely classic binary gender roles in Judaism do not look like the way they look in Christian Western culture. It is extremely traditional to expect that Jewish women work outside the home. It is extremely traditional to expect that the most masculine of Jewish men should be pale and at least Eastern European beauty norms should be pale and delicate, having not been outside in the sun and having spent time as a Torah scholar. And that sounds a lot like women to a lot of very binary Western ears, living in that tension of what the cultures around us think of as masculine and feminine, and what we think of as masculine and feminine, as well as joining with Jews and non-Jews around us to verge forward into, from my generation, don't tell me what feminine means, don't tell me what masculine means, and on into a multi-gendered society. It leaves those of us in small minority traditions with both having different ideas than many of our friends and neighbors do, and hoping that that diversity in our own lives gives us extra possibilities so that we can entertain the idea that there are many ways of being male and many ways of being female, even within an aggressively binary old school system. Hopefully it helps.
That's great. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate the way that you've articulated how a covenantal framework for a faith community is in many ways bigger than the particularities of gender or identity or orientation or attraction, that those things matter. And those are conversations that happen within the framework of the community. But the idea of Torah or of another legal framework or covenantal framework is about bigger picture, more kind of zoomed out concerns than those. It's not that those don't matter. It's that the covenant is what helps us to all protect each other, and then hopefully extend that protection to our neighbors and to folks who are vulnerable and marginalized on the outsides of our community, as well as those who are inside. That's great. Thank you. Sarah, again, you can take this in any direction you want. The church I used to attend, where I find faith now, me and my husband in our home, whatever.
I love it.
How do you make space, or how does your tradition or the way that you understand God make space for intersectionality and for nuance when we talk about what it means to be a person of faith and also to be part of the LGBT plus community?
Yes. Thank you. Excellent question, Rabbi. I just learned so much from you about your traditions. Thank you so much. But what I was thinking of, what I grew up with is the purity culture. Lust says now, love says later, marriage, a 3-year engagement, being above reproach, things like that. You don't question authority, you don't talk about money, and certainly you don't talk about sex. And that's how we got in this mess, right? But this journey has taken me to where once you see it in this arena, the issues at hand, the crisis, the problems that we have, you see it everywhere, everywhere. And then I think about going to my first drag show and thinking lightning was going to strike me as I entered the threshold of the doorway at the Boom at 39th and Penn. And then crying hot tears as I saw this beautiful expression of gender identity, raising money for a homeless shelter for the youth. So it's about seeing God and the power of the Holy Spirit in people, in you, in the world around us, and being able to look past those biases and the obstacles, the duping, if you will, but still being able to honor something greater than ourselves, not only greater than ourselves, but in each other. And it's a really wonderful place to be. And lastly, the fruit. You know, we hear a lot about the fruit of the Spirit. And so when I think about the messaging that we're hearing from the bills being passed, just even today with, you know, things happening, we have moms in Texas looking for safe places to raise their transgender children. But the fruit of the Spirit is love. And if what the church is doing, if what we are doing as a society, as a culture, is it empowering? Is it lasting? Is it building up? Is it nurturing? Is it feeding and serving? That's the fruit of the Spirit. And that is love, and God is love. And I would rather be on that side of the story, because anything less than that is shame. Is shame, and that's sin. I think that's the real sin.
I love that idea of sort of erring. If we're going to err on the side of love. A good friend of mine who is also a pastor is known for saying, you know, sure enough, the longer I'm in ministry, the more often, every single time, when I draw a line between me and the other, I can count on Christ being on the other side of that line. I can count on my understanding of God being with the other, being in sort of compassionate presence with the other, being in solidarity with the marginalized. And I appreciate that as sort of a metric for understanding who we are as people of faith, all faiths and no faiths, but also how our beliefs shape the way that we find ourselves in relationship and in conversation with marginalized communities, all marginalized communities, but particularly the LGBT plus community, and maybe particularly in Oklahoma. That's helpful. Thank you. Dr. Pitt, I know that where you are now and what you believe now is not exactly the same as the way that you were raised, but how would you want to contribute to this conversation about how people of faith can understand the intersection of faith and also LGBT plus sexuality and expression?
Well, I've been thinking about that as I've been listening to everyone talk. And there's a couple of things that I've thought of. One of the things I wanted to share that I think is very important is in working with a particular family and working on helping the parents be accepting of their adolescent's transgender identity. One of the questions that came up is, how am I going to have this discussion at church with my pastor? And I had to just kind of step back a little bit and give the parents some time to think through what that might look like and how they might go about that, and what they anticipated response-wise from their faith community. And what ended up happening is that the parents, after reflecting, came back and essentially said, yes, I need to reach out to my faith community and let them know that this is happening, and my child is moving in this direction, and this is how this is going to go. And we are in total support of my child. And if they cannot be supportive, then we're going to have to look elsewhere, which was for me a great victory for that child, because they needed their parents to stand up for them, no matter what they were standing up against, even in something that's so strongly embedded as, their faith or their religious community. That really spoke volumes about where that parent was in terms of having to make some very difficult choices to support their child who was transitioning. The thing I think that we spoke on at the beginning that keeps coming back around to me is that I feel like faith and religion are not at odds with science. And that so much of the time is kind of how things are put. If you look at what all goes in biologically to create a gender identity, it's very complex. It's not a set of anatomy that somebody is born with. That's not it at all. There are so many factors that go into it biologically. And as we've been talking about intersex people, that's a great example of how complex these topics are that we're talking about. That's a great biological example of how complex that these issues are. Dating way back when, when an intersex child would be born, it used to be that doctors would make a decision about what that child's biological sex would be, and then their gender identity would be from a very early time. And guess what? They often got it wrong because it's not that simple. And I think there's an oversimplification of what all goes into sexual expression, sexuality, gender identity, gender expression. And there's a disconnect in that way where it seems so black and white in the faith community, and in the scientific community, it is incredibly complex, and it is far from black and white. And I think if we could bring some of that together to help people be more educated and understand that this is not a simple matter, and that there have been for thousands of years this range of sexuality, this range of gender identity, I think it could help open people's hearts and minds to being more accepting and loving of other people.
Dr. Pitt, my last question to all of the panelists is going to be connected to resource recommendations. And so we'll give everybody the opportunity to point to particular articles or websites or books or what have you, where folks can learn more, podcasts, really great Twitter follows. That floor is wide open. But as a microcosmic example of this kind of nuance and the importance of specificity of language, most of what I know and understand about what it means to be intersex and what it means to be transgender are experiential. I graduated from a very small, very conservative Christian university, and my roommate senior year was intersex and transgender. And their identity was chosen for them. Their gender expression was chosen for them. They did not identify with that from a pretty early age. And for a variety of reasons relating to safety and propriety and the perceived risks of coming out did not come out as intersex or transgender until they were in their sort of mid-late 20s. For folks who are brand new to the specificity of language that accompanies this conversation, can you just maybe draw the distinction between what is gender and what is biological sex? Because I think a lot of us, including me, were raised not to talk about it, as Sarah said, and that is part of the reason we have some of the problems that we do. But B, would not have been taught the difference between something as elemental as gender and gender expression, as opposed to biological sex. And that's not the only thing that matters in this conversation, but I think it's a great sort of microcosmic point that hopefully will encourage folks to dig deeper into all of our sort of collective knowledge base. But can you just kind of flesh out that one particular example? And then we will come back to the sort of bigger resources question at the end.
Sure. So I think this is a great question, actually, because I see this confused all the time out in the public. So I don't think anyone is alone if there's, some confusion around this. So biological sex are the chromosomes that you are dealt at birth. So you come with a set of chromosomes that we label in the medical community and in society as either being male, or you come with a set of chromosomes that are different from that, and those are labeled as being female. With those sets of chromosomes come certain physiological characteristics. So that is considered biological sex, okay? Gender identity is a much different idea than biological sex. Gender identity has to do with the construct of how one sees themselves in this realm of possibilities for gender. Now, for the most part, I think in the United States, there's been fairly restricted binary choices around gender. For many years, you were either identified gender-wise as male or female, but gender constructs have to do with how you relate societally, and to the world about how you feel like you fit in these constructs that are put forth by our societies. For me, I'm a cis female, but I also recognize gender-wise that there is a part of me that's very masculine. It's part of why I was rejected from the church, to be honest, in terms of just being very much about pursuing things that were very non-traditional. And so gender is about how we think about ourselves and how we fit in those constructs. And sometimes those constructs don't fit for us at all, or we're a blend of those constructs. And that is very common across many different cultures. Somebody mentioned the two-spirit idea a minute ago. Very common Native American ideology about gender. So there's all these possibilities that step outside of the binary gender thoughts that are so common and prevalent in this country. Anyway, many other countries have multiple options for gender that we just don't embrace, because there's an understanding that there is a blending of who we are internally and how that comes together. And it's not just about whether you're male or female. Male or female is a biological idea. That's a sex idea. Gender really has to do with how we relate to the world and embrace different pieces of ourselves, which may contain elements that are assigned to biological sex. Like some people might really like pink. Well, pink is associated with being a biological female, you know what I mean? But they might be a biological male, So gender identity is a much more complex concept that we construct in our head based off of not only what we come with biologically, but how we're socialized, how we're treated, what our experiences are, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, if that makes sense.
That's good. I really appreciate that. That sort of broadly speaking, sex is about biology, and broadly speaking, gender is about sort of sociology. And also both of those things are more complicated than simply XX or XY, because there are also lots of other things that are possible. And more about what boys like and what girls like, or the idea that boys and girls are the only categories that we can use to describe gender expression. Okay, that's super helpful.
Absolutely.
I appreciate you indulging me in that particular rabbit trail. And we'll appreciate and experience it as one example of a much broader conversation that would take weeks to have. And that's okay with me, but I don't want to impose a week-long Zoom call on anybody else. Pastor Scott, help us understand, could be broadly in your denomination, even more broadly in sort of Western Protestant Christianity, could be really particular to Mosaic. How do you and your faith tradition sort of identify and experience the intersectionality of LGBT plus sexuality and also being a person of faith?
Well, first, let me just say, before we get to that, I thought we should get interfaith T-shirts to wear at the Pride Parade that say "It's a new world," in honor of the Fiddler on the Roof. But I also made the mistake, Dr. Pitt. I was listening, but I was multitasking, and somebody left a comment on Facebook that said, "By and large, Jews are drinkers." That's billboard worthy. So maybe we have some competing T-shirt themes here. Well, I think on a personal level, and I think this would be true of Methodism and certainly of Protestant Christianity and really all of Christianity, all of life is interconnected. And I think that's also something we get from our Jewish ancestors and siblings. I mean, you can't compartmentalize your faith and your sexuality and then how you make money and how you make a living and then the politics. I mean, it's all interconnected. So your class and your race and the color of your skin and all of that, it's just all it's all intersectional. And I think that we would say like at Mosaic, I'll speak for Mosaic, or for me as the pastor at Mosaic, I don't just preach a message for people to think about spiritual things. I mean, I talk about, I'm not an expert in a lot of topics, right? I mean, my master's degree is in theology or divinity or whatever, but if what you believe about God doesn't also somehow intersect with your political beliefs or your beliefs about individual rights versus what it means to live in community. I'm having a long debate with my cousin about this. He's I can't think of the word for it, but he's very much about individual rights and the community. He doesn't care about the community. I'm like, isn't it a balance though? We all live in community for the most part. So how do you balance that? And so does your faith speak to that? Like, does our faith speak to the issues at our Oklahoma County Jail? Like, does faith speak to that? Does faith speak to the environment? And so does faith speak to our sexuality and our identity? And I think in some ways people might try to really separate these out. I'll give you an example from a former church where, I mean, it's common for people to go off to college and not come back to their faith community, at least for a while. That's pretty common. But if you happen to be gay or anywhere in the alphabet soup, right? If you happen to be any of those letters, or more than one of those letters, whatever, you might stay away from church because you might feel like, and this is all messed up, right? It's like, is it because those people I grew up with gave me the vibe that it's wrong and I don't want to go back into that environment? Or is it because I know that my denomination teaches whatever it teaches, right? Or is it that I somehow feel like I'm just separated from God because that's how I've been raised as a citizen of this country, sort of like, the loudest voices out there, the Franklin Grahams of the world, right? Being gay is wrong, being gay is a sin. You need to pray for change and all this stuff. So is there just somehow that we're raised in this environment so that maybe we don't feel like we can even be a person of faith as well as embrace your sexuality and embrace your identity and embrace your life that maybe you've embraced off at college or or in your first house, or you're renting an apartment, you got your first job. And so I definitely think that at Mosaic, like, we don't want to say, well, we can't talk about stuff about sex at our church. I mean, we can talk about sex. We can talk about, no topic should be off limits at the church. If a church is supposed to be a safe place, then why would any topic be off limits? And so we, for example, we don't ignore sexuality in our words of our liturgy or any of that. We talk about, that when Jesus shared meals with people, and especially at that Last Supper, I picked this up from somebody else, but that was his chosen family. I mean, he wasn't there with Mary and Joseph. He wasn't there with any of his, if we think he had siblings, but he was there with his chosen family. And that's language that the queer community has used long before probably pastors or other people started using that language, right? And so if you think about that, if you're a person in the pew and you think, yeah, I'm estranged from my family, and I've got a chosen family, and Jesus had his own chosen family. And I recently been talking about some of the stories from what we would call the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures. We talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we sometimes forget it's Abraham and Sarah, but it's also Abraham and it's his son Isaac, but it's also his son Ishmael. And how does Ishmael play into that? It's Isaac and Rebekah, but it's also Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, right? And if Jacob and Esau are brothers, let's talk about gender identities, right? Jacob was a mama's boy who liked to be in with his mother and the other women and cooking and all that kind of stuff. Esau was the man's man who wanted to go out with his father and the guys and go hunting, right? And if you're hearing that story and you're in my youth group and you're a queer kid who doesn't fit the normal, quote, normal, that you're supposed to be as a boy or a girl or whatever, those stories can just be eye-opening to you. And then you can see yourself in the scriptures, whereas perhaps you've never seen yourself in those scriptures before because you've never seen anybody in those scriptures that looked like you. Now, I'm not saying definitively anything about Jacob or Esau or any of that, but we can sure get a lot from those scriptures. I mean, and come on, Joseph's dancing around in a coat of many colors, which in another part of the Bible is referred to as a princess dress. And his brothers didn't like him very much for several reasons, but one of those reasons was his dad gave him that coat, right? And we've got kids that dress in ways that draw attention to themselves. And in ways that when I was in high school, people weren't dressing that way. Or if they were, I was sure oblivious to it, right? I mean, so it's like, if you can see yourself in those scriptures, to me, there's the intersectionality right there. And all of a sudden you say, maybe these scriptures aren't exactly what I think they've meant or that I have been taught they've meant like my whole life. And I think that even I as a pastor, and I say this in my sermons, even on Sunday mornings, I have a lot to learn still. I mean, and if I ever get to the point where I'm like, I know it all, I'm done. I should just hang up because I'd be done. I mean, I am still learning so much. And so to me, if we're not about intersectionality, what are we about? Just what are we about? So I say bring on the intersectionality, and that's what we try to do at Mosaic for sure.
That's helpful. I appreciate that. And Pastor Scott, I really appreciate, and this is sort of your launch point, the idea that nothing that we believe is only about one particular thing or is only about one particular topic. If we're the people who, so like, for example, in my own tradition, in the Church of the Nazarene, our big thing, our big sort of contribution to Western American evangelical Protestant thought is a real sort of insistence on the importance of holiness, but also defining holiness as becoming more and more perfect in our love for God and our love for each other, right? That holiness is about how we continue to extend and embody the love of God to everyone, God, neighbor, and self, everybody. And so if me, my congregation, my denomination, if we are who we say we are, then that holistic way of living and understanding who God is as love can and should permeate everything that we do. And yeah, the way that we talk about marriage, and yeah, the way we talk about sex, but also the way we talk about money, and the way we talk about criminal justice reform, and the way that we talk about sexism, and the way that we, et cetera, et cetera. I appreciate that. That's a helpful framework and a convicting one for me. Well, folks, we have already kept you about the maximum amount of time we said we were going to. So we'll do one more question for each of the panelists, and it is kind of a joint question. So the first question would be, what resources would you like to draw people's attention to expand our understanding of this conversation? I will ask you to say them out loud now for folks who are watching our recording. I will also ask you in a separate email, you don't have to remember, to email me links to the authors, the podcasts, the articles, the studies, the Netflix documentaries, anything you want to share with our folks, and then we'll put those out on social media over the next week or two. But please let us know a couple of resources you would like to point us to. And I'd like to close with a question: what gives you hope for the future of this conversation? Maybe particularly in Oklahoma, but what gives you hope when we talk about what it means to be an LGBT plus person of faith or no faith in Oklahoma? So resources, and then also what gives you hope. Rabbi Jacobson, take it away.
Thank you. There are a lot of good ones. For those of you who know the organization PFLAG, their Jewish section is excellent, and largely put together by Jewish people. So start there. Another good one, Keshet Online. Keshet, Keshet, is the Hebrew word for rainbow. And from Israel, the Jerusalem Open House, Beit Patuach, the Jerusalem Open House. And what gives me hope is that so far it feels like people who are pursuing a deepening of their faith, who happen to have come into contact with me and my colleagues, are by and large more comfortable identifying themselves, if they are a minority in terms of gender or sexuality, than in the past. That gives me tremendous hope. It also gives me tremendous hope that I've said a number of stupid things and people continue to love me. And that gives me great hope, not in the LGBTQ community or the Oklahoma community, but in humanity in general, and in the grace and love of God, that I can say stupid things and people will just say, can we go back over that for just a second, and have been gracious when I have done the same. And if we can continue doing that, we can move toward not hurting each other with legislation.
That is a whole word. Thank you, Rabbi Jacobson. And I appreciate that idea of long way to go, but some important steps in the right direction. And hopefully that orienting direction is love. Thank you. Sarah, I will talk about your books if you don't talk about your book. So talk to us about resources that folks should be aware of, but then also please, what gives you hope for the future of this particular conversation?
The resources that I would offer could be found on our website, freemomhugs.org. We're building it. There are so many resources out there now to not have a better understanding. And what brings me hope is conversations like these. And when families allow their children, whether you're 7 or 77, to show you who they are, because I believe that change will come from affirming homes to the world around us. And the more we can encourage that as a church, as a place of business, the more it will be. So
that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate that. Dr. Pitt, resources you'd like to point us toward, but then also what gives you hope for the future of conversations, maybe especially in Oklahoma, about the intersections of faith and human sexuality?
I also would point people toward pflag.org. There's lots of books that are on there, books for adults that are going through gender transition, books for adolescents, books for children. There are books for parents of children. There's just so many resources that can help people navigate and understand and educate and learn. So that's a great resource, I think, if I love books, so so most of my resources are books. I do have hope. This is the second panel discussion I've participated in like this, which gives me such great hope that we are shifting away from embracing only people who conform to a certain ideology, and we're moving toward what I believe is true love, which is embracing people where they're at and giving people what they need and being respectful of people, and being able to do that with people who are not the same as me, is the same as you, is the same as as anyone. I think that this community that is really pushing forward in this way of trying to bring the idea of faith and religion around to that embracing is just such a light of hope. It is a lighthouse in an area that is like a barren desert, frankly. In an area that is pushing so hard to minoritize and marginalize a group of people, this is the lighthouse. And this, I believe, is the thing that will bring change to the masses, is when the masses see the faith community and religion embracing and loving people, then they will be like, oh, this is okay. This is what we should be doing.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And it reminds us that these are not just important conversations for faith communities, but important conversations for broader society to see faith communities having in ways that are loving and responsible and scientifically informed. That's great. Thank you. Pastor Scott, what are some resources you would point us to if folks want to explore these conversations further? And then also, I guess I don't want to presume that anybody has hope for the future of this conversation, but if you feel hope, why would that be?
Well, there's a lot of great resources, and PFLAG is certainly one of them. I think Q Christian Fellowship and Reformation Project, or some others, Trevor Project, definitely. And I always send people basically to the Free Mom Hugs, because Sarah and others have compiled a great list of resources that she frequently will post on social media. And the Real Mama Bears has a great listing as well. I don't really keep up with a lot of podcasts. I actually feel really old to say that, but if you're looking for a book, I mean, God and the Gay Christian by Matthew Bynes, it would speak to people who kind of live in the Bible Belt and who consider themselves to be Christian and really take the Bible seriously. And I think it's a good starting point. I think Matthew's not like the definitive person on this, but he gives a good overview of it and can really lead you to other sources if you want to go deeper. If you don't want to go deeper, then he's a good spot to start then. Just to give you some looking at the Bible in ways that you probably have never thought of or knew that others were even looking at it that way, or what's not just looking at it, but what's the scholarship behind the Bible, a lot of our interpretation of the Bible and what's out there, which is not what we're hearing in a lot of our pulpits. You know, in our pulpits, we sort of hear one thing, there's a lot of scholarship and a lot of other interpretations out there. And then if you, like me, you're also looking at other religious traditions, such as Judaism, etc., that you're looking at them as well to enlarge our understanding of the scriptures and of the holy. I do have hope. I have hope because I see our young people being so bold. The young people I work with now are out and teaching me things, whereas the youth I worked with 30 years ago, I might suspect they were gay, but they were very much in the closet. And so I think that it's just a different world. And I think that I have learned so much from our young people. But I also just think that there is hope because I believe in a good God who created this world and called it good. And I just am an optimist in that. But I know when we look around our world, sometimes it might seem boy, we're in a mess everywhere, but I do have hope. And even in Oklahoma, yes.
Thank you so much. I am grateful to each of you and all of you for sharing your ideas and your experiences and your expertise in these conversations. I'm sure it will not be the last time we talk about these things together, and I'm sure it will not be the last time that I ask you to come back and do something like this again. But in the meantime, this has been a production and presentation of the Interfaith Alliance of Oklahoma. If you are interested in who we are or what on earth we're talking about, you are welcome to find out more at our website. That is tiaok.org. You can find us on social media. We are on Facebook and Instagram for sure. And I hear also Twitter. Twitter is not a good idea for me to engage with spiritually. So I try to stay off of it, except for sort of keeping track of my favorite terrible soccer team. So if you'd like to know more, we would love to hear from you. There are contact forms on the website, or you can post questions on the Facebook chat, and we will be in touch with you. We are grateful for everyone, again, who has participated in this discussion. I want to point out, we said at the beginning, and I want to say again at the end, no faith is monolithic. No faith tradition is monolithic. There are plenty of folks who do not identify with any particular faith tradition, and their experiences and their identities matter just as much as everyone on this screen. None of us, if you've listened to our stories, are from exactly the same place, exactly the same faith tradition, or even the same sort of movement or denomination inside of those faith traditions. And most of us do not believe exactly the way we did when we were who we were 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. We are, many of us, probably all of us, on a journey of understanding and of embodying the kind of love that we've talked about as a motivating force for our faith traditions. And so with that in mind, recognizing that there is strength in that diversity and in that difference, and also that we sometimes embody that same diversity ourselves in our own life experience. I want to close with a quote from a guy that Scott talked about earlier, a guy named John Wesley, who's also sort of one of the founding parents of my own faith tradition. But this particular quote gives me help. He was not always a particularly ecumenical guy, much less an interfaith guy. But I think he believed the right things, even if he didn't always express them in ways that were healthy towards other faith traditions. Wesley used to say, though we cannot think exactly alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart, even if we are not of one opinion. Without all doubt, we may. And herein all the children of God may unite, notwithstanding these smaller differences. I think that's true for people of faith, all faiths and no faiths, that if and as we orient ourselves toward love and love of each other, we'll find ourselves more and more in companionship and in conversation with the other, every single other. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Sarah, Pastor Scott, Rabbi Abby, Dr. Pitt, thank you so much for being with us. And we will hope to speak to you again soon. Have a good evening, all. Thank you.